December of 1986. 11 horses walked off a cargo plane onto a stretch of desert so lifeless that local ranchers had given up calling it land altogether. They called it the place where nothing grows, no grass, no water, winters that would plunge 40 degrees below zero. China had just poured millions into flying these zoo-raised animals halfway across the globe to release them here. And virtually every serious ecologist alive considered it a guaranteed death sentence. A BBC crew arrived to capture the release on film. They packed their bags and flew home after just 2 days, convinced they were documenting a catastrophe as it unfolded. What those 11 horses did after that, nobody thought was remotely possible. This project is one chapter in a quarter-century effort that started when 4 wild horses were brought into a zoo with the single purpose of eventually being returned to the wild. 11 horses against a dead desert, because these are no ordinary horses. They are Przewalski's horses, the last genuinely wild horse species remaining on Earth, extinct in this region for 17 years. The Chinese government had just spent millions of dollars flying them halfway around the world from zoos in East Germany and the United States, then releasing them into a desert that was consuming 3,000 square kilometers of new ground every single year. Leading ecologists had already declared the project a death sentence before it even began. These were animals that had lived their entire lives eating hay out of buckets and drinking from automatic waterers. Now they were being turned loose into a place where winter temperatures collapsed to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit and summer highs soared to 104. The nearest water could be 15 kilometers away, buried beneath 4 inches of solid ice. The horses themselves looked almost otherworldly, compact, sturdy builds, stiff mohawk manes rising straight up like something out of a child's drawing, faint zebra-like stripes running the length of their legs. They looked less like modern animals and more like the figures our ancestors carved and scratched into cave walls 40,000 years ago. These are Przewalski's horses, the sole surviving wild horse species on the planet. Desert survival specialists gave them perhaps a 15% chance of making it through the first winter. One ecologist, writing in Nature magazine, described the entire endeavor as throwing good money after dead soil. Local officials in Jimsar County were already preparing public statements to explain the disaster they considered inevitable. And to grasp why anyone would attempt something this reckless, you first have to understand what the Yungar Basin had actually turned into by 1986. Because this was not just another conservation effort. This was about preventing an entire region of China from becoming permanently uninhabitable, a wasteland that was actively consuming the country. The Yungar Basin had not always been a wasteland. For 10,000 years, wild horses had moved across these steppes. The entire ecosystem had developed around the rhythm of their hoofbeats. Then, in 1969, they vanished. Not slowly, not gradually, completely. The last confirmed sighting was recorded by a Soviet geological survey team. A few hoof impressions pressed into dried mud, a small cluster of tan hairs snagged on desert grass. After that, silence. And here is the part that caught everyone off guard. What followed was an ecological collapse on a scale that left even the most pessimistic scientists stunned. Without horses breaking up the surface, the soil compacted into something researchers began calling biological concrete. Rain still came to the region, 4 to 6 inches each year, but rather than soaking into the earth, water sheeted across that impermeable crust and evaporated within hours. Seeds could not pierce the surface to take root. Nitrogen levels fell so sharply that by 1974, scientists were comparing soil samples from the basin to lunar dust. The material was still physically present. The grains of sand and silt looked identical under a microscope. The basin had simply gone biologically dead, and then the desert began to move. Satellite images from 1982 showed the Gobi expanding at 70 kilometers per decade, swallowing grasslands, villages, and farmland whole. Highways had to be rerouted. Railway lines were being buried beneath advancing sand. Beijing, sitting more than 1,000 miles away, was getting battered by dust storms that dragged on for days at a stretch. And here's the thing. In March of 1983, a single storm dropped 43,000 tons of topsoil from the Yonge Basin onto the Chinese capital in under 72 hours. Hospitals recorded a 300% surge in respiratory emergencies. People were choking on a desert they could not even see, pulling into their lungs the earth from a place 1,000 miles distant. So China threw everything at the problem. The Green Great Wall Project, kicked off in 1978, set out to plant a forested barrier 4,500 kilometers long stretching across the northern edge of the country. But here is where it fell apart. The trees demanded far more water than the desert could offer. Water tables that had held steady for centuries dropped by 12 meters in certain regions. The trees themselves, planted in orderly rows, like soldiers on parade, began dying from the roots upward, as those roots could no longer reach the sinking water. Entire villages had to be abandoned when their wells went completely dry. Engineers tried sand-fixing grids woven from straw. They experimented with drought-resistant shrubs. Nothing managed to hold the line. By 1985, the situation had grown into a full-blown catastrophe. Agricultural output in Xinjiang province had collapsed by 34%. The desert was advancing on Beijing more rapidly with every passing year. Computer models predicted that at the pace things were going, the Chinese capital itself would be barely livable by 2150. And that is the disaster a small group of Chinese ecologists, led by a researcher named Yang Jianming, was staring down when they walked into a government meeting in 1985 and put forward something that sounded like pure fantasy. Yang stood before officials who had spent 2 decades watching tree after tree wither and die, watching wells run dry, watching the dust slowly consume their capital city. And he told them to stop. Stop waging war on the desert with bulldozers and tree plantations. Bring back the creature that had kept this landscape alive since the last ice age. Bring back the wild horse. By every account, the room was not exactly enthusiastic about this idea. But the numbers were so dire and the failures so complete that within a matter of months, his plan received approval, which left exactly one question hanging in the air. How could animals born in zoos, hand-fed by humans across 3 generations, possibly survive a place that was swallowing cities whole? The last truly wild horse. The Przewalski's horse is not just any ordinary horse. Look at its DNA, and you will find 66 chromosomes rather than the 64 carried by every domestic horse on Earth. It is the only horse species that has never been domesticated, never broken, never brought under human control. While people were selectively breeding Arabians for speed and Clydesdales for raw power, Przewalski's horses remained exactly as they had been when our ancestors were sketching them onto cave walls in the distant past. They are a living portal into the Ice Age. The Przewalski's horse is genetically distinct and stands as the only true wild horse subspecies still in existence. But here is what makes it all the more remarkable. By 1985, that portal was nearly shut. Only around 900 of these animals existed anywhere on the entire planet, and every last one of them lived inside a zoo. The whole species traced its lineage back to just 12 to 14 individuals captured between 1899 and 1903 by Russian explorers working under commission for European zoo collectors. After World War II, the global population hit an absolute low of 31 horses, with only 9 of them capable of reproduction. At one terrifying moment, the species clung to existence in just 2 places on Earth, the Munich Zoo and the Prague Zoo. Every Przewalski's horse alive today carries that genetic bottleneck within its cells, a chromosomal scar from having come within inches of vanishing forever. The simple fact that any remained to be sent to China in 1986 was, in itself, something close to a miracle. China's plan, drafted in 1985 and set in motion in 1986, unfolded across 3 phases. The first was to import horses from Western zoos and acclimatize them at a newly constructed breeding center established in Jimsar. The second was to move them into vast, semi-wild enclosures, essentially teaching animals raised in captivity how to be wild once again. The third phase involved releasing them into the Kamili Nature Reserve, 4,000 kilometers of some of the most unforgiving landscape in all of Asia. Among the earliest horses transferred into the Jimzar enclosures was a young stallion carrying a clean white blaze stretching down the length of his face. The keepers gave him the name Hong. Hold on to that name. Now this is where things start getting really fascinating. Yong's case to the government went far beyond simply arguing that these horses could stay alive. His claim was that they would actively restore the entire ecosystem around them. These animals do not merely consume grass, he argued. They reshape whole landscapes. And once you grasp that, the whole story starts making complete sense rather than sounding like a fantasy. It all comes down to three things. The first is raw physical power. Each of these horses weighs somewhere between 600 and 800 pounds. When they gallop, their hooves strike the earth with 800 pounds of pressure per square inch, which is actually greater force than a jackhammer delivers. In a place like the Yungar Basin, where the soil had hardened into something resembling biological concrete, that is precisely the kind of force required to crack the crust apart and allow water to work its way back in. But here is something no machine can replicate. Horses are deliberate. They move around fragile young seedlings. They only hammer into bare ground and dead plant matter. They can tell the difference. Then there is the matter of how they travel. GPS data collected later showed that Przewalski's horses cover roughly 15 kilometers each day in patterns that mathematicians describe as fractal. They graze intensively in one spot for several hours, then suddenly shift miles away before looping back around again. It appears chaotic. It is anything but. This movement creates what is called a disturbance mosaic. Short grass here, taller growth over there, bare patches scattered throughout. Each of these tiny microhabitats ends up sheltering different species of insects, birds, and small mammals. The horses are not simply feeding. They are constructing a living patchwork across the landscape. And here comes the third element, which honestly sounds the most outlandish. Horse dung, as it turns out, is not waste at all. It functions as a delivery mechanism. Analysis of Przewalski's horse droppings revealed living seeds from more than 20 distinct plant species inside, and passing through the horse's digestive system actually boosts germination rates by as much as 300%. The acids within their gut scarify tough seed coatings and break dormancy in seeds that might otherwise have remained locked and inactive for years. A single gram of dung holds up to 7.4 viable seedlings. That is double the dispersal rate of cattle and 8 times that of sheep. Because these horses travel those 15 kilometers daily, they are effectively seeding enormous stretches of territory, building genetic corridors, connecting plant populations that had been cut off from one another for decades. Every dropping left behind is, in every meaningful sense, a self-watering, pre-fertilized seed packet. That was Yong's proposal. That was the theory in full. The difficulty was that the horses about to be released had spent 3 to 4 generations living in captivity. There are currently 900 Przewalski's horses in China, which represents a remarkable accomplishment for wildlife preservation. But those animals did not know how to locate water in a desert environment. They did not recognize the sound of a wolf as a warning of danger. They had never lived through temperatures that dropped below freezing or climbed above 90 degrees. They had lost what researchers referred to as the culture of survival. The learned behaviors handed down from mother to foal, the kind that no amount of genetic programming alone can ever substitute for. So the question that would ultimately determine whether Yong was a genuine visionary or simply a fool came down to something straightforward. Had 3 generations spent inside zoo enclosures extinguished the instincts buried deep within these animals? Or were those instincts still present somewhere, quietly waiting to resurface? Before we move forward, before I describe what actually unfolded when these horses first set foot on that desert ground, do me one small favor. If this story is capturing your attention, go ahead and hit subscribe and tap the bell icon. Stories exactly like this one are what we explore every single week. the kind that force us to completely rethink what we believed we understood about how the natural world truly operates. And what comes next in this story is the part that nobody thought could actually happen: the zoo-born horse's first winter. What one stallion did on day 8 after release, and the figure researchers eventually arrived at for what a single one of these animals is worth to the ecosystem. Stay with me. The payoff is on its way. A winter that should have finished them. Those opening months at Jimsar were a battle that nearly proved every critic correct. Within a matter of weeks, botfly infestations had struck 100% of the herd. And these were no ordinary parasites. The larvae burrowed deep into the horses' stomachs, carving out painful lesions that wrecked their digestion at precisely the moment they needed every last calorie just to make it through. Then the first winter arrived, and that first winter was nothing short of catastrophic. Temperatures plunged to negative 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The horses, raised in heated barns their whole lives, pressed together against frozen winds that tore across the desert like blades. Their signature mohawk manes turned into solid icy ridges, so thick that some horses were unable to lift their heads from the ground. Snow swallowed what little grass remained under 3 feet of powder, and this is where things turned truly brutal. The staff at Jimsar, Yong's team, watched through binoculars and were under strict orders not to step in unless the entire herd faced complete annihilation. 7 horses developed severe frostbite. 2 mares lost their foals to the cold. The international press had already begun drafting the project's obituary. Conservation journals were putting together post-mortems of what they fully expected to be a textbook disaster. Yong himself, as he later openly admitted, had begun bracing for the worst. But something else entirely, something no one had written into the script, was quietly unfolding out on that frozen steppe. The stallions began hammering the ice with their hooves to reach the water underneath, a behavior that had never once been documented in any zoo anywhere in the world. The mares started arranging themselves into protective formations around their foals during storms, using their own bodies as windbreaks, rotating positions whenever one mare grew too cold. The horses learned to sweep through the snow with their front legs in a broad, digging motion, uncovering grass that no domestic horse would ever have thought to search for. They began reading the wind, working out which slopes had been swept clean by the cold, and which had piled up with deep drifts, and that is saying it mildly. They were not merely surviving, they were remembering. Generations of zoo life had not wiped out what was encoded in their very bones. Those instincts had been lying dormant, waiting. The desert was drawing them back out. By the spring of 1987, the transformation had moved far beyond anything the project had anticipated. Grass species that had not been seen anywhere in the basin for 17 years began pushing up through the soil in areas where the horses had grazed. Compensatory growth, the process by which grasses bounce back faster and thicker after being clipped, boosted biomass by 43% in grazed zones compared to areas left untouched. The horses were not degrading the land, they were stimulating it. The soil itself began shifting in ways that left the scientists monitoring it genuinely stunned. In that first year alone, moisture retention climbed by 23%. Not because rainfall had increased, not because the climate had changed, because the horses' hooves had punched roughly 10,000 tiny craters into every single hectare of ground. Every one of those small depressions became a miniature reservoir, trapping precious rainwater that would otherwise have sheeted off the hard pan and evaporated within hours. The horses were rebuilding the basin's entire plumbing system, one hoof step at a time. The second year delivered another shock. Nitrogen levels surged by 37%. The horse manure was doing far more than simply fertilizing the soil. It was reintroducing the gut bacteria the soil had been starved of for decades, an entire microbial community that had disappeared the moment the wild horses had vanished. By the third year, botanists were recording something that by all logic should have been impossible. 22 plant species had come back seemingly out of nowhere. Their seeds had apparently been lying dormant beneath the soil for close to 2 decades, waiting for just the right conditions to sprout. The basin had never truly been dead. It had simply been sleeping, holding on until the one species capable of waking it arrived. But here is the thing. Surviving a single winter does not mean a population is restored. The horses still had to pull it off again and again. And when that second winter arrived, it would determine whether the first remarkable season had been the start of something real or just a lucky accident. The ecosystem stirs back to life. It was no accident. The horses made it through the second winter, then the third, then the fourth, and once the vegetation returned, everything else came with it. Dung beetles, gone from the basin for 15 years, came back by the millions. They buried horse manure into the ground, further enriching the soil and speeding up the cycle of recovery. Field surveys began recording 43 insect species that had not been seen in the region for decades. The insects brought the birds in. Larks, wheat ears, and sand grouse moved into the area to feed. Small mammals followed behind the birds. Gerbils, pikas, ground squirrels, and then the predators made their return. Foxes, steppe eagles, and even the occasional gray wolf began turning up on camera traps. Every new species added another layer of complexity, another feedback loop, pushing the recovery further along. By the late 1990s, the herd at Jimzar had grown large enough and the basin had recovered well enough that Yang's team made a decision that would have seemed completely absurd 10 years earlier. They were going to pull the fences down. In August of 2001, the project stepped into its boldest phase. 27 horses were chosen for full release into the Columile Nature Reserve. No fences, no supplemental feeding, no human involvement of any kind. Just horses in 4,000 square kilometers of desert that had not seen their kind in 32 years. Among those 27 was Hong, the stallion with the white blaze on his face, now fully grown and leading his own harem. The scientists fitted GPS collars, positioned camera traps, and waited anxiously. During the first week, the horses stayed within 500 meters of the release point, almost as though held back by invisible chains. They wandered in loose circles. They grazed with obvious nervousness. They kept glancing back toward the pens. And then, day 8 arrived. Day 8. It was just after dawn. The wind, according to the field notes, was blowing steadily out of the northwest. The GPS team at the monitoring station was watching their screen, mostly out of routine at that point, when one of the dots on the map began to move. Then the dots surrounding it began to move as well. Hong was on his feet, and his herd was lining up behind him. He did not wander. He did not stop to graze. He walked due north in a straight line, as though he knew precisely where he was headed. The dots kept moving. 5 kilometers, 10, 15. The monitoring team began making phone calls. By the time Hong stopped, he had led his harem 30 kilometers north to a water source that appeared on none of the project's maps. No one had pointed him toward it. No previous generation of his bloodline had traveled that route within his lifetime. He simply knew. The team drove out the following morning to verify what the GPS had already shown them, and there it was, a spring-fed pool, half frozen, nestled against a low ridge. Hong stood beside it as though he had been coming there his entire life. How he knew remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the whole operation. Some form of ancestral memory, perhaps. Something carried on the wind. Some pattern in the geology that horses can read and we simply cannot. Within a month, the horses had established their territories. Stallions were marking boundaries with deliberate dung piles placed on elevated ground. Natural foaling rates reached 87%, surpassing what most zoo populations are ever able to achieve. And the foals being born out there in the wild were displaying behaviors that captive-born horses simply never show. They could distinguish 23 different plant species by scent alone. They responded to the shadow of a golden eagle overhead by freezing completely still. Their winter coats grew thicker than those of their parents, and the transformation of the landscape had become visible even from orbit. Satellite images revealed green patches spreading outward from the horses' home territories, like explosions happening in slow motion. The water table, which had been sinking by 3 centimeters each year since 1970, leveled off in 2003. And then it began climbing. The horses had switched back on a hydrological pump that had lain dormant for an entire generation. That single number broke every existing model. What was unfolding in the Yungar Basin tore apart everything China believed it understood about combating desertification. For 25 years, the Green Great Wall had rested on a single idea: put trees in the ground to hold back the sand. By 2010, China had planted 66 billion trees at a total cost of $47 billion. In many regions, those trees had made the core problem dramatically worse, pulling moisture from the earth faster than the land could recover. And here is the part that should have reshaped everything. While China's enormous tree planting campaign was quite literally drinking the desert dry, the horses were doing exactly the opposite. They were pulling the water back, their hooves punched infiltration points into the surface, allowing scarce rainfall to sink deep into the soil rather than evaporate off the hardened crust. Their grazing was keeping grasslands alive, which demand 90% less water than forests do. A single horse was improving water retention across 50 hectares of land every year. Then someone ran the numbers, and the results stopped sounding like ecology and started sounding like a financial report. When ecological economists settled down to work out what one Przewalski's horse was genuinely worth to the ecosystem around it, they came back with a figure no one had anticipated. Soil restoration was valued at $12,000 per horse per year. Seed dispersal came to $8,000. Water retention, $15,000. Carbon sequestration, $7,000. Biodiversity support, $5,000. The total came out to $47,000 per horse per year. When they calculated the cumulative figure, the economists became the next group after the BBC crew and the conservation journals to stare at their own results and check them twice before they trusted what they were seeing. Because by 2023, those 11 horses had grown into 534. And the herd was effectively stewarding 26,700 hectares of land, a stretch larger than many national parks, generating $25 million in ecological value every single year. And that was a conservative estimate, leaving out tourism revenues, scientific research value, and what the basin had by then become worth in carbon offset markets. Among those 534 horses were Hong's own descendants, dozens of them spread across the reserve in their own family bands. The dead soil they had first been turned loose onto now supported more than 20 plant species that had not grown there in decades. The desert that had been swallowing thousands of square kilometers every year was now retreating, pulling back at a rate of 47 hectares annually in the zones where these horses wandered. The approach traveled fast. Mongolia released horses into Hustai National Park in 1992, and by 2023, the population there had reached 490 individuals, with the surrounding steppe showing restoration patterns identical to those in Xinjiang. Kazakhstan launched its Golden Steppe project in 2024, transporting horses from Prague and Berlin into the Kostanay region. 8 years on, there were more than 100. Now nearly 1,000 have been set free to range across Central Asia. Russia has been quietly absorbing the Chinese data. Every project kept validating the same core principle. You cannot engineer an ecosystem from above using human blueprints and poured concrete. You have to rebuild it from the ground up using evolutionary tools already tested across thousands of years. China is now extending the Kalamyli Reserve by a further 350 square kilometers. The official target is 2,500 wild horses in place by 2040. Computational models indicate that a population of that scale could rehabilitate more than 100,000 hectares of damaged land, capture 43,000 tons of carbon annually, and sustain more than 300 plant and animal species that currently have no other home in China. If they manage to pull this off, the Yungar Basin will become the first desert in all of recorded human history to be turned around, not through planting, not through irrigation, not through engineering, but by the pounding hooves of wild horses. The 11 animals that walked off that cargo plane back in 1986 were not simply a handful of endangered creatures being moved to a new location. They were a living technology, shaped and refined by millions of years of evolution, fully capable of designing and sustaining an entire landscape on their own. We just needed to remember how to flip the switch. We just needed to stop doing it ourselves and hand the job over to the real experts, the ones with hooves. The Przewalski's horses push us to confront a deeply uncomfortable question. How many of the environmental crises we are dealing with right now could actually be solved by returning the original engineers we drove to extinction rather than pouring trillions of dollars into human-designed fixes that consistently fall short? The bison that sculpted the American prairie, the wolves that keep the forests of Europe in balance, the elephants that tend to the savannas of Africa. Throughout the modern age, we have been trying to engineer nature back into shape. But nature had already worked out the solution long before we arrived. We just killed it off, and then we lost the recipe entirely. Leave your thoughts down in the comments. If you had the power to bring back one extinct ecosystem engineer anywhere on the planet to heal land we have destroyed, which species would it be? And what's your reason? I read every single comment. And if you are drawn to stories about animals that have literally transformed entire continents, hitting that subscribe button is your obvious next move. The story we are working on next just might be the most extraordinary one yet.